Hi everyone, and welcome to this video in this series on A-level students and the skills that they need to develop for their studies. So today we're going to be looking at writing analytical paragraphs, and this is the second video in this little subsection. So in the first video we looked at how to craft a point sentence or an overview statement, and in today's video we're going to be looking at how to embed evidence into your writing. So I've got excellence criteria as usual. Now the first thing to do is to have a really careful selection of your evidence. You don't want to be just picking any quotation just because it's the one that you remember. The next thing we need to do is to embed that evidence really fluently in a sentence, so it flows nicely and it supports the argument rather than seeming to be kind of bolted on. You know, I want to include this quotation because I remember it and it looks good. And the other thing you need to start doing at A-level is to use mini quotations to back up your ideas. So some of you will have done that at GCSE, but I think part of the problem with GCSE writing is that we use a very strict formula for our paragraphs. So you have your point, you have your one piece of evidence, and then you analyse that evidence, and then you move on to your next paragraph. But at A-level we need to move away from that really strict structure to our paragraphs. You can use lots of pieces of evidence in one paragraph if it's necessary. And that's the main thing to remember. Is it necessary? Is it carefully selected? Is it going to develop your argument? Because it's your argument that has to drive the choices that you're making in your essay. So to help model this, I've got a question here, pretty straightforward question. How do writers create tragic settings? And if you're doing AQA A-level and you're studying the tragedy module, then this will be really familiar to you. So the source I'm using for today's video is a wonderful poem by John Keats called La Belle Dame sans Merci. And if you don't know that poem, go away and read it and pause the video now, look it up online. It is a beautiful, beautiful poem. And so this is our section of the poem that I'm going to be using to take my evidence from. And it's the first stanza of the poem. So the speaker of the poem says, "Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing." So essentially what's happening in the poem here is that a speaker has come across this knight in the middle of the countryside in a rural landscape, and the knight is just wandering around looking very ill and having no particular direction. And as the poem develops, we realise that the reason why the knight is doing this is because he's been in love with a fairy and then she's abandoned him and she's left him alone in the middle of this rural place. So thinking about our question then, how do writers create tragic settings? The first thing you would do is write your introduction, but I think that's for a separate video. So then we need to write our point sentence. So we've practiced this in the previous video. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but let's just have a little think about how we're going to answer the question. So initially, Keats creates a setting. Keats creates a setting which emphasises isolation and decay. Okay, so we've signposted where we are in our essay. We've used some really specific vocabulary. Remember I talked in the last video about being precise, but not necessarily being too ambitious, but making sure your vocabulary is the right words, the right vocabulary to use. Then after that, you'll remember from the previous video, we need to make sure we're linking it out to the big picture and to our argument for this essay. So I'm going to put a semicolon. So thus Keats communicates the desolation at the heart of the human condition when one is or when one loses out on love. Okay, I hope you can read that okay. So we've got our point sentence, and that does all of the things that I spoke about in the previous video. So what we need to do now is start to add in our evidence to make sure that we can substantiate this point, give solid kind of reasons why this point is relevant. So you may be very familiar with at GCSE using phrases like a quotation to show this is, or we see this in the line, whatever. We want to get away from that at A level and start to fluently embed the quotations in the sentence. And that means kind of telling the story a little bit. As you tell the story, you're going to put those quotations in there. So let's show you what I mean by that. So first of all, I'm going to choose the quotation that I'm going to use. So I don't want the whole paragraph here. I'm focusing on isolation and decay, so I'm just going to use this bit here, and no birds sing for the moment. So as the speaker observes the desolate, again using really precise vocabulary, as the speaker observes the desolate landscape, they hear a lack of sound, realizing that oh, sorry, you can't quite see that there. So as the speaker observes the desolate landscape, they hear a lack of sound, realizing that no birds sing. So what you can see I've done here is I've started to tell the story. So kind of as if I was a novelist almost, saying the speaker observes the landscape, and then I've just slotted in my quotation towards the end of the sentence. So if we look at the excellence criteria, we've got careful selection of quotation because I've chosen the quotation that's going to be really relevant to my answer. I've embedded it in the sentence. Now, the other thing I've said here is to use mini quotations, and that's if they're relevant, if they're going to be useful for you. So we'll look at this in a separate video, but what I would put at this point is analysis, maybe of the language or of the structure of the poem. And then because this line is repeated at the end of the poem, it's going to be really relevant to me to put in another mini quotation from the end of the poem. So I could put here, similarly, as the poem is drawn to a close, the speaker recalls that the sedge is withered, and again no birds sing. So I've kept those quotations nice and short so that they're not cluttering up my essay with too much detail, too much unnecessary detail. But what I have done is use sections from elsewhere in the poem as evidence within the same paragraph, and that's absolutely fine to do, particularly if you do want to move away from that very structured kind of P paragraph or P-Lee paragraph system that you might have learned at GCSE, and you want to move into something a little bit more sophisticated. Okay, so give that a go yourself at home. Thank you very much for listening, and in the next video we're going to look at how to analyse these quotations.